Good afternoon, folks. I'm Scott Fraser. I'm the City Floodplain Administrator and the guy responsible for sending you those notices. I'm going to pause at various times during the presentation today and leave some screens up on the, or some slides up on the screen for a while longer because most of the people who signed up for this are going to be viewing remotely. Maybe after the event or on television. So I kind of have to keep that in mind when I'm talking to you all. I'm the floodplain administrator and the FEMA coordinator for the city. And if there's one overriding thing I want you to take away from this workshop today, is that Scott Fraser does not work for FEMA. For those watching on television or later on YouTube, you see this URL here, and if you go to that, you can get the handout that we're going to be referring to today. LOMA is a short abbreviation at FEMA for Letter of Map Amendment. And why do we want one? Because we're going to go into that, the benefits, the cost, if any. For straight out LOMA, there is no cost. There are some different variances which are kind of expensive. We'll go into that. Does your property qualify for letter or map amendment, and how to apply to FEMA for one yourself? We start with the flood maps for the city. This is mostly the whole city. And you'll see in the center this unshaded area here. There are X zones and shaded X zones. And that's the unregulated portion of the flood zone in the city. So if you come to get a building permit, there's a whole bunch of reviews you don't have to go through and compliance measures you don't have to meet if you're in that zone. There's a closer look at that X zone or shaded X zone. They're technically slightly different, but for our purposes, it doesn't really matter. They're just considered the X zone. So what happens if your property, or specifically your building, is straddled by one of these flood zone boundary lines? And this will directly affect your insurance as to whether you're in that golden X zone or not. And the rule is, if a flood boundary line touches the building to any degree, then the entire building is in the next higher zone, or the highest regulated zone. So in this image on the screen, you can see the gray area is the X zone, and the shaded yellow area is the AE6 flood zone. And AE6 meaning that it is regulated, insurance is required if you have a mortgage, and that the first finished floor has to be at least 6 feet above sea level if you were to substantially renovate that building or build a new one. Now, according to the building code, it's plus 1 foot. So in actuality, if you were to come in and build something or renovate something, it would need to be at 7 foot in this flood zone. Well, that only tells us how high the first floor has to be. It doesn't tell us how high above the ground it is. And for that, we need an elevation certificate. We're going to get into that discussion. All the buildings with the red dots are in the AE6 flood zone. So they're all considered in that yellow shaded area. And they all have the mandatory flood insurance requirement. So the benefits to getting a LOMA are lower insurance rates. When you're in the unregulated flood zone, the X zones, there's not a requirement that you carry flood insurance. So it gets dramatically cheaper. I did this for a friend of mine who was in the AE6 flood zone. He got a LOMA, and his insurance rates went from $1,450 a year to $450. So the cost of the elevation certificate paid for itself right away. Right? Fewer construction requirements. If you were to put a shed in the backyard, you'd have to jump through a bunch of hoops. I wouldn't even look at it. wouldn't come to me. Right? It improves the resale value of your property, and this is becoming more and more important and has so in the last couple of years. When they did flood insurance reform, that's when we saw these drastically increased flood insurance rates that were making the newspaper like $49,000 a year and that kind of craziness. It got fixed, but only temporarily. Congress has got to go back and address it again, and I have no idea what they're going to do as far as the outcome. So property appraisers around the state have started taking an initiative to value properties higher if they're at or above the flood level. Okay? When people go for loans to get mortgages, it's no longer a matter of can you afford the mortgage, it's can you afford the mortgage and the wind insurance and the flood insurance payments. If your building is in the X zone or gets a LOMA saying it's in the X zone, then that is dramatically reduced. And it makes selling your property a lot easier and makes it more valuable. These green dots represent LOMAs we've already obtained for these people here. There's a couple more out on Flagler, but this is the majority of them. So let me tell you how this got started. It got started from a code enforcement violation last month. And what happened was a guy on Stump Lane was building something and he exceeded the scope of work on his permit, and code enforcement tagged him with a complaint. And it came to me when he applied for the new permit. And I said, okay, fine. And I looked at it, and we have new software now, GIS, or Geographic Information Service. And I opened up an elevation map, which is measurements taken every 10 feet by aircraft. And it gives a rough approximation of what the ground level is. And so when I looked at this, I said, oh, wait a minute, this is a 6-foot flood zone. All these measurements are more than 6 feet. He shouldn't be in a flood zone. And then when I zoomed out, I thought, well, the whole neighborhood's like that. So none of those houses should probably be in there. Now, LIDAR isn't exact. What is exact is an elevation certificate. So we'll get to that point. But this is a good indicator that these property owners should be pursuing a LOMA. So I asked the Geographic Information System, I said, okay, show me every property where the ground by LIDAR or at the aircraft appears to be higher than the flood zone. So in a 6-foot flood zone, where is the ground apparently higher than 6 feet? And these are the number of properties here. The purple ones, they were all started out as purple, but as you signed up for these, they turned to green to tell me what percentage was responding. Now, there's a term we have to understand in flood insurance, and it's relative to this date. This was the date that flood insurance is said to have begun in the city, and all buildings that existed at that time were grandfathered into the flood insurance program at whatever elevation they happened to be at that time. And that grandfather exception continues until the house is either demolished or substantially improved, meaning renovated more than 50% of its value, and then it has to be elevated. The flood insurance rate maps are known as FIRMs for short. Right? If your building was built before that date, it's a pre-firm building. The reason the term pre-firm is significant is because before flood insurance reform kicked in 2012, FEMA didn't know how high or low your pre-firm buildings were below the flood level, so they were all applied the same rates. And then at some point they said, well, wait a minute, we're charging the same rates to a property that's 1 foot below the flood level as opposed to another that's 6 foot below the flood level. So that's disproportionate. Somebody with higher risk should be paying a higher rate. Unfortunately, they didn't follow that through with some testing first, and that's where we got those exorbitant rates. So what's happening now is you're going to need eventually an elevation certificate to show where your house is at. Now, they haven't come outright and said, in order to renew your policy, you're going to need an elevation certificate. That was what they talked about at first, but they didn't do that. Instead, what they said was, your flood insurance rates are going to increase anywhere from 18 to 25% per year until it reaches that rate as if it had never been subsidized. But they don't know where that rate is because they don't know what level your floor was at. So we'll get into it in a moment as to why you're going to need an elevation for that, even if you don't get a LOMA or qualify for one. So this is a picture of a typical elevation certificate. They've changed a little bit over the years, but they look pretty much the same. One of the key points here is notice it's multiple pages. A lot of people just have the front page. You gotta find the whole page, because oftentimes FEMA won't consider it because there's other information on the back page that relates to the front page. But there are some key measurements on the front page that are going to be very helpful, and that's where we're going to be able to determine if your property qualifies. So if you don't have an elevation certificate now, FEMA doesn't know when to stop escalating your rates. So if your building is a foot below the flood level, 2 foot below the flood level, maybe even 3, you want to make sure that you're getting an elevation certificate and you're getting it in the hands of your insurance agent. And they will put it in your file. And so when they keep escalating your rates, it'll get to a point someday where it'll level off and say, okay, they've reached the area where they're being charged at the proper rate. Otherwise, it's going to keep escalating over that. If you don't have a elevation certificate currently, you can check the city's website. We don't have them all. We only have them if you submitted it. There's somebody that owned the property before submitted it to get some sort of building permit or whatever else they were seeking. So you can look at the city's website. You see the URL down at the bottom. It's the regular city website with a little addition at the end, /flood. And there's a whole wealth of information there. You can check with your flood insurance agent. They often have them if they wrote the policy. Or you could hire a land surveyor. Now, on the elevation certificates, if you have one, you'll notice up in here there's an expiration date. You can disregard that expiration date. That's only the expiration date for FEMA's version of that form. Your elevation certificates do not expire. What does happen, though, over time, if you have a really old one, then a lending institution may say, we're not going to honor that one, we want a new one. And they can make you go out and get a new one if, for whatever purposes you're applying to them for. So you can go to our website and you can hire a land surveyor, or you can see a list of land surveyors. There are a list of local land surveyors. We've got them all there. And you want to shop around because the price can vary quite dramatically from one land surveyor to another. And remember, when you're calling them and asking for prices, don't call and ask for a survey. You're going to pay a lot more money. All you need is an elevation certificate. On an elevation certificate, you will see at the bottom that it can be completed by a surveyor, an engineer, or an architect, and that's not true in the state of Florida. This is a federal form, so don't go to an engineer or an architect to try and get one because it's not going to be accepted in Florida. And they will fill one out thinking they can do it, but they can't. With the elevation certificates, only one building can be on that certificate. In old times, in the 90s, they sometimes mentioned 2 buildings on one elevation certificate because the measurements were the same. You can no longer do that, and it doesn't have any validity to it any longer. So here we see the elevation certificate, and we've got some key measurements here that we want to pay attention to because This is the crux of the form that's going to get your LOMA application approved. So we see these clouded areas of the form. Right in the middle here, in this block, we have the, right up here, it's the base flood elevation. Remember we were looking at the map of the flood zones earlier and they had that shaded yellow area? Well, that was the AE6 flood zone, the key part being 6 feet above sea level. So that's our baseline. So where is the height of the ground on this lot? And we find that down here. The lowest adjacent grade. And so when a surveyor measured this, he came out and he took several measurements. One was the height of the first floor. The other was what flood zone is it in? And another one was the lowest adjacent grade next to the building. How high or how low is the ground next to that building? And that's the key measurement that FEMA is going to look for to approve your LOMA application. Now, when FEMA created these flood maps, they know they did so with a very broad brush. They kind of went down and said, okay, these houses in this zone are in a 6 foot, and these are 7, and these are an 8. They knew there were going to be abnormalities in there. So they created the letter of map amendment process to address those specifically. So in the instance here, most everybody has property in the 6-foot flood zone. And we had indications that the ground is higher than 6 feet. If you look at your elevation certificate and you see AE6 up here in the corner, and you look down to lowest adjacent finished grade next to the building, and the lowest adjacent grade is equal to or higher than the base flood elevation, you're going to get your letter of map amendment. And what it's going to take is running around town getting some documentation for the most part, in large part from the property appraiser's office. So there is no cost associated with a basic LOMA, or letter map amendment, because FEMA knew there were going to be abnormalities. That's why they created this process, and it's very simple to do. And we're going to get into the mechanics of the application now. There is another type of LOMA called a -F, which means it was put a top fill. And this is a much more complicated application, and there's a hefty cost to it as well. And if we were to look at Key West, we'll say, well, gosh, 80% of the island is probably on fill of some time. But, you know, we have to start somewhere. So if your house was built top sand or fill that was brought in specifically to elevate it, and it's higher than your neighbors on all sides, then yeah, it's probably going to be a -F or a LOMA F application. And if you have that scenario, then you need to get together with me so we can look at it in depth. So the form that we apply to FEMA for this LOMA is called the MT1. There is another one out there, and you'll even see it on our website, but I'm going to take it down. It's called the MTEZ, and it's supposed to be quicker, faster, better, but it's not really. It was designed for people who don't have an elevation certificate. But in order to complete the form, a surveyor has to go out there and take a series of measurements. And the difference between the measurements they would have to take for that form and the one they'd have to take for an elevation certificate are insignificant. And so you're not going to save any money, and you wouldn't get an elevation certificate in the end, so you might as well get the elevation certificate because you're going to need it for other purposes. So in the handout, let's see. I'm past the slide where it says MT1 form. And we're going to the top of page 1, which says property information form. I've already checked off the blocks in the handout that's going to apply to most all of these applications that you're going to put in. it's just a LOMA. We don't want to pay any attention to the rest of these. Those blocks have already been checked no. When we get down to the lower half of the front page, it talks about the legal description. I've just been lifting those from the property appraiser's website. When you go online, I would print one of these out anyways, and just include it with your application. It never hurts. And down under property details, you'll see legal description. And I usually copy and paste that right into that block. Also on the website at the property appraiser's office is the year the building was built. You'll need that to fill in this blank here. Don't get too hung up on the dates. Really, it doesn't matter if it was 1950 or 1930. It's that magic date they're looking for, which is 1974 or 75 or thereafter. So then we get to page 2 of the application. And the very first thing it gets to is a copy of the firm. So what we're going to do, we're going to show you how to make what's called a firmette, because these firm maps are big drawings like this. A firmette's going to be on an 8.5 by 11 sheet. It's going to have the FEMA information on it, and it's going to be a legal version of the firm, but it's just going to be neighborhood orientated to your map, or to your neighborhood and to your building. This is what a firmette looks like. And to go into how it's done, I'm going to direct you to the website because there's a whole page that will allow you to go right through it and make one of these. But essentially what you're going to be doing is they're going to have a square over here, and you're going to drag that over to your neighborhood. And it's a pretty wide area, so you only have to be close. And then you'll be able to print out this firmette and include it with your application. Now, I recommend 2 of these for your application because you want this unmarked copy going to FEMA just like if they were to pull it off the website themselves. And then you want to mark another one to point out where is your building and make it really clear to them. Circle it, put a big arrow there, put anything you want on it to draw attention to it there. Because remember, they're looking at a lot of these and they're looking at them quick. Right? If you go to the city's website, again down here, it will take you through the process of how to make a firmette. And it's really not that hard. The next thing they're going to ask for is a subdivision plat map. And this is basically what it looks like. I got this off the property appraiser's website. And it was pretty easy to make, but I don't recommend doing that yourself. And the reason I don't is because it needs to be certified. And one recommendation I want you to really remember when you're gathering this documentation, every time you get a piece of paper from one of these agencies, get it certified, get it stamped. You'll notice right down here, this is the certification stamp from the property appraiser's office. And if you don't have that, FEMA's not going to accept it, because anybody could make one of these and alter it on their home computer and produce a counterfeit. So they want to see that stamp down there. So don't waste your time submitting an application without the certification stamp. If they won't put it on the front, have them put it on the back, but have them put it on there somewhere. I've not had one rejected because the stamp was on the back. If you're in a scenario where you have multiple buildings on one lot, there's an alternative measure you can go to, and I'm only going to mention it here briefly today. But if you already have elevation certificates for those buildings, then you might as well go through this process that we're talking about today, because you've got the bulk of the effort already there. Right? If you don't, then there's another option, and that's to get the entire lot recategorized as being in the X zone or out of the regulated flood zone. So every building on that lot will be removed from the flood zone. This is what a LOMA looks like when you get it. It's a little bit hard to read and understand, like everything from the federal government. But this is the key part, what you're looking for. What is removed from the Special Flood Hazard Area? That's what SFHA stands for, right? And we see in this case it was a structure. Most of yours are going to be structures. The only time that changes is when it's a scenario where you have multiple houses and the lot was removed from the flood area. So in this instance, we see it was a building, and the flood zone is X. In this case, a shaded X, but it doesn't really make any difference. It's still an X zone. Right? That's what you want. The turnaround time for this, it used to be, well, the last time I did one a couple months ago, it was like 4 days from FEMA when you did it online, because you could go through this process online, submit all the documentation. That has proven not to be the case in the last few weeks, because I got one pending now and it hasn't showed up yet. By hard copy, it's probably 2 to 3 weeks when you mail it in. That's basically how it's done. Have we got any questions? Yes, ma'am. Okay. So your house is in the X zone completely? Right. Then it's not worth your while to do that, unless you were going to put a shed or another building on that lot. Right. One thing I caution you against is if you get a LOMA and you get your property reclassified as an X zone, I wouldn't go running out and cancel your flood insurance. And there's a reason for that. It may not always be in a shaded X zone. We're going to get remapping in probably 2019. And what you don't want to have happen is to have your flood insurance rates start escalating because you got a new policy. Because if your flood insurance policy lapses for 30 days or more, then it automatically jumps to the full rate as if you had just bought that property. The other thing is, there are a number of properties across the nation that are in X zones that incur flood damage. And what happens is, if you cancel your flood insurance policy, FEMA comes around with disaster assistance after the fact and says, well, okay, let's say you had $80,000 worth of flood damage in your house, but you could have got $40,000 if you had flood insurance. But because you didn't have it, we're not going to pay you that amount. So they take the $80,000, they minus what they think you would have got from flood insurance benefits and give you the difference. So an $80,000 disaster assistance would turn into half that amount real quickly. And I get, yes, because you had the opportunity to buy it and didn't. Other questions? The question was, what does it mean if you're grandfathered in? When the flood maps became effective, January 1, 1975, those buildings that were built before then were not up to flood standards or flood code standards. So it was presumed that they were all below flood, which in many cases is exactly where they were. And they were rated as all being pre-firm buildings, which means they were presumed below the flood level to some unknown degree. And so they were all rated the same, they were all paying the same amounts, but some were having incredibly huge payouts. And one of the catalysts for flood insurance reform was that they started finding that some of these buildings had collected more in flood insurance claims than the buildings were worth. There was one in Galveston that was 220%. I have one here in the city that's probably 200%. And they have done nothing to mitigate the problem. So FEMA said, number one, we're going to start paying or charging these people what their risk actually is. So if they're 6 foot below flood level or 8 foot below flood level, we're going to be charging them that amount instead of just charging everybody the same. Now, that grandfathering exists until you improve the property more than 50% of its value. So when we get building permits of any significant value, we start tracking them. And we say, okay, you're going to do $80,000 worth of renovations. Well, that's, we look at the value of your property and we say, okay, well, that's maybe 20%, 30%. And it's calculated over 5 years. And when you start getting close to 50%, we start saying, well, wait a minute. If you do much more work, you're going to have to elevate that structure to code requirements today. And that's the technical term for that is substantial improvement. And I have a number of web pages on on the city site regarding this topic. Did that answer your question? Okay. I got plenty of time, so I'm going to hang around afterwards to talk about individual cases. Yes, in the back?
If you have, we currently have flood insurance. We have it obviously because we're outside the X. If we change to the X is better. We could still buy flood insurance, but it would be less money because it's in the X still. Is that?
Yeah, so the question was, we have a building that's in the regulated flood zone, and if we get the LOMA approved, and it's now classified in an X zone, can we buy flood insurance? Yes, absolutely. And because you don't have to buy it, is why it gets so much cheaper. So it's
If we do, we buy it at a lower price, and then we get reclassified out of the X zone. Do we have the same problem we mentioned before, where they may not honor it, or they may only give you half?
I think I understand the question. Let me answer it this way and see if I got it right. One of the key things we have to keep in mind if you're in a shaded X zone today, well, that's real close to the 6 foot flood zone. Well, we're going to have remapping in 2019, so we don't know where those zone boundaries are going to be then. We can roughly guess. So if your house today is in a shaded X zone, it's conceivable that it could be in an AE6 flood zone when the new flood maps come out. If so, you would want to be in a position where you already had flood insurance because you're not getting a new policy. You're getting a new policy, but you're getting it at the X zone rates. So it's not going to go to the full actuarial rate. So you want to be in a position already where you've already had flood insurance.
Okay. So it's not like you canceled it and don't have anything. It's not the same situation as you decide to just cancel your policy altogether. You have it, you just have it at a lower rate.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. When you have flood insurance in the X zone, it's known as the preferred rate, which is a substantial discount. And my FEMA folks tell me that if any community that's going to be remapped in the near future, it's usually beneficial for everybody that's close to that edge to buy flood insurance a year prior. Yes, ma'am?
If your existing elevation shows you slightly below the 6, does these individual who did the survey maintain records of exactly where that little dip was so that you can, is that in a database somewhere?
Yeah, the question was, if your elevation certificate shows that the level of the ground is slightly lower than the flood level, does the surveyor record where around your house that was? No, they don't. They might have it in their notes somewhere, but they're not going to go digging through that archive to find it. They'll tell you, get another elevation certificate. But If you're looking at your elevation certificate and it's 5.8, 5.9 in a 6-foot flood zone, FEMA's about as compassionate as the IRS, you know. It's not enough. It could be 5.99999, you're not going to get your LOMA. Right? But there are other options, and we could talk about that offline. Yes, ma'am.
But if you are in the X zone, you should go through this process. Is that what you're
No, if you're already in the X zone, yeah, you wouldn't get a change to your letter of map amendment.
Because your X zone is already on the record?
Right, it's already on the record. We were talking about flood insurance and the need to have flood insurance, and in the X zone you don't need it. But suppose the flood mapping changed that in 2019 and now you're in the flood zone, you would want to have a policy that was already active at the X zone rates prior to remapping.
But you should check to make sure that your policy is at the X zone.
Yes. And another thing I noticed a couple of years ago was this is how it started at my friend's house when I went over there. Your flood insurance bill was sitting on the table, and I saw $1,450. There's no way you should be paying that amount of money for flood insurance because his house was elevated 2 foot above grade. And when we checked into it, we found out it was rated as slab on grade, meaning it's just a concrete slab on the ground. And of course, that's why his bill was so high. And it turns out that nobody had ever told the insurance company that there was an elevation certificate and that showed a different elevation. So it was a matter of simply bringing that over here to show them, oh look, it's not slab on grade. And when they enter these things into the computer, that's the default rating. And they have to change it or know to change it. Some insurance agents are really good about that and asking and following up. Some just let it go at the default rate, more often than I would like to see it. Yes, sir? It's computed into your flood insurance rate. So in your instance, you're saying that it's a AE6 flood zone, right? Right. And the lowest adjacent grade is 7.6. Okay, so it's more than a foot and a half above the flood zone. And the first finished floor is at 11. Yeah, you're probably getting a pretty good discount already, simply because it's elevated. Most of the pre-firm homes are not elevated like that. Is this a pre-firm home? Yeah. Then if you already have an elevation certificate, I would go ahead and apply for the LOMA. It does nothing but benefit you, particularly when you come to us for renovations. Then you don't have to go through any floodplain review, so we don't have to bother with your elevation certificates. And you've also increased the value of your property by getting a LOMA with little or no effort. Okay, I'll hang around. Yes, sir. Yeah, remember I told you at the very beginning, remember Scott does not work for FEMA? Yeah. This is one of those reasons why. The only documentation FEMA will accept for the elevation of the ground in the building is this FEMA elevation certificate. Yeah. I will accept the spot surveys for certain things so you don't have to go out and get one of these things and pay for 3 of them, but FEMA won't. All right. Okay, thank you.